Hello, everyone, and welcome to Thursday Night Live. My name is Adam Jacobs, and today it gives me great pleasure to be joined by Rabbi Dr. Joshua Berman, who I've been a fan of for many years. He doesn't know that. Read most of his books, and I've been looking forward to this conversation for a long time. A little bit about him. He earned his BA at Princeton and his PhD at Bar-Ilan University. He also is obviously an ordained rabbi. And he is currently a professor of Bible at his alma mater, Bar-Ilan. Well, Rabbi Berman, please, thank you so much. Welcome to the show. How are you?
Okay, thank you, Rabbi Jacobs, and it's a pleasure to be here.
It's my pleasure. And I just want to mention before we get started that for all the audience out there, please subscribe to our YouTube channel button there. We have updated all the things that we're doing, this conversation and many others. Rabbi, I am reading your book currently, Ani Ma'amin, which means I believe. I'm enjoying it tremendously. And let's just jump right in to the question that we're dealing with today. Is it a fact that the Jewish people once lived in Egypt and then migrated en masse out of that land into the land of Israel? Or is that somewhere in the realm of an embellished myth?
Right. I think that there's very good reason to think that our forefathers were slaves in Egypt and underwent an event that they understood as miraculous and left Egypt. And I think that there's good evidence for this. That's my basic position. Yes.
Okay. So it really happened. We were really there, and thousands of years ago, so a large group of people was living in another nation and left, and that is what we call the Exodus today. Okay, so before we even get into how we know, which of course people will want to know, and you are an expert in, let me ask you this question. Why does it even matter? For instance, can't we enjoy King Lear and know that it really didn't happen, but there was all the intrigue and incredible value of that story, and we learned so much from it. Isn't that good enough, or does it have to be a fact for it to be valuable?
So you're right, Rabbi Jacobs, that you can read great literature, and maybe the Book of Exodus is great literature, and maybe we can understand the story as metaphor. All of us have our own personal enslavement, and we all undergo episodes of liberty, and read it on that level. You can do that. But if we're talking about what it means to be a Jew, what it means to have a responsibility to serve the Almighty, then it matters a heck of a lot that there was Exodus. And I'll tell you why. It's because when God appears to the Jewish people, or let me put it this way, just to back up, there's nothing that I'm assuming that's because of the yarmulke on my head. When the Torah says that the Almighty appeared to the Jewish people at Mount Sinai, and he began to explain to them the following things that they're going to need to do, the commandments. The way in which he explains is that I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage. And this is why you are obligated in this. Now, that means that if there really was no Exodus, then the whole basis of what the Torah is saying about why anybody should be obligated to do anything Jewish has no basis, because it's all a myth. And so therefore, to establish a relationship of gratitude and of homage and of debt, there has to have been some type of founding event. And that is why the Exodus, from a Jewish standpoint, is really so important. It is the basis for all obligation that we have to the Almighty.
Okay, I think that's certainly a thorough and important answer, and something that we all have to think of. But that means that the stakes are quite high in terms of this story. And my subjective feeling, having been in the Jewish education field for more than 20 years, is that either people are largely bought into it in an unexplored way, they've received it from somebody else and they simply accept it as facts, or they simply assume that it's not fact. And like any other number of myths from other cultures, that it didn't happen, but it's an interesting story. But here you are as a scientist and as a rabbi, and you're saying no. In fact, there's good reason to think it did. So, is there archaeological evidence for the Exodus? And are there other well-known migrations that took place along these lines that you could speak to?
Sure. Okay. Let me start with some of the claims that are made against the veracity, against the historical accuracy of the Exodus. Because the claims on a priori from the outset are reasonable. That is, in all of the writings that we have from Egypt, there is no mention of Moses. There is no mention, explicit, clear mention of plagues or anything like the plagues that we have in the book of Exodus. There is no mention of Hebrews. There is no mention of Israel. There is no mention of slaves upping and outing. You know, you can understand why some people might say no evidence. Okay. Now, the truth is that there's a lot of the attempts to find evidence are not fully aware of the nature of these types of inscriptions. So, for example, no references to Israel or Hebrews. Right. That's because, by way of analogy, in the antebellum South in the United States, nobody called their slaves by where they came from. They just had one derogatory catchword for all their slaves. And so did the Egyptians. The Egyptians didn't care where their slaves were from. So you wouldn't expect to find Israelites or Hebrews. You also wouldn't expect to find anything bad about Egypt written in Egyptian records. That is, Egyptian records are, you know what I like to compare them to? Imagine that you run an office, and you have an opening in your office. And you put out a call for people, you know, you're looking to fill the position. You get a stack of resumes. And you go through the resumes and you go, wow, this is such a talented, amazing group of people. I went through 100 resumes and not a single one of them said I was fired from my previous job. Well, of course not, because no one writes that in a resume. Because in a resume, you're going to put your best foot forward. And that's what pharaohs were doing all the time when they wrote these inscriptions. So you wouldn't expect to find bad news. Now, all of that is by way of kind of moving aside some of the objections. But how does that get us beyond zero? That is, okay, there's nothing, you know, okay, there's no proof against, there's no proof for. No, there are actually things I think that are very concrete. But I think that most scholars, until very recently, have been looking in the wrong direction. What do I mean by that? By that, I mean that scholars have said, look, if we want to determine the historical accuracy of the Torah's account of the Exodus, let's go look in our Egyptian sources, of which there are many, and see, do we see any references to any of these people, things, entities, countries, people? And you don't find. But there's another way to do it, and that's to go the other way around. Do we find any references about specific things from ancient Egypt in the Torah? And this winds up being beautiful stuff. Let me give one small example.
Please.
Probably all viewers will recall from their experiences around Seder tables of years past that we have this phrase that appears in our Haggadah, but it's also in the Torah itself many times, that God took the Israelites out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Right? That's from the Torah. Now, there's something interesting about that phrase, and that is that although you would expect that maybe the Torah would use, or the Tanakh, the Bible as a whole, would use that phrase anytime the Almighty performed a miracle. You know, it would say, oh, there goes the Almighty again with his mighty hand and his outstretched arm. It turns out that phrase is only used in the Tanakh with reference to the Exodus. And I'm going to tell you why. It's because when we go to Egyptian sources, from the period that corresponds to a traditional view of when the servitude was, roughly the last part of the second millennium BCE, what you see is that all the pharaohs who lived in that age, everything that's written about them always extols their virtues, that they did this, that, and the other with their mighty hand and their outstretched arm. They conquered the Libyans with the mighty hand and outstretched arm. They went hunting and bagged 120 elephants, the mighty hand and outstretched arm. Pharaoh was walking one day and he picked up a diamond off the floor with his mighty hand and his outstretched arm. Put differently, this is an Egyptian phrase. This is an Egyptian royal propaganda phrase. Well, what's it doing in the Torah? And what's happening here is what we call cultural appropriation. It's where you take your opposition's mantra and steal their thunder. To use a contemporary example of that, if one side says Black Lives Matter and another side says, well, Blue Lives Matter or Cops' Lives Matter, right? Without getting into the politics of it, that idea of taking someone's mantra and putting it to make it your own is a way of cultural opposition, cultural appropriation. And this is one small example. We can see huge examples of this in the Torah with very specific reference to a very specific text from a very specific period. This is the material that I wanted to share. If we have it, if you want it, Rabbi Jacobs, this would be an appropriate time.
Okay, so I think we will. I guess just before we get there, we can leave it up there, that's fine. But just one question on that. In terms of cultural appropriation,
yep.
I know we can't fully answer this question, but like why do it that way? Why is it the nature of a divine supposedly documents to like thumb its nose in the face of the enemy, and to make fun of their traditions and or to take any aspect of them? Why one might think that, if I was the Almighty, I would have completely original material, and I would do things our way and set for the stage for the way things are supposed to be, as opposed to the arrogant and haughty way in which pharaohs conducted themselves, and using these arrogant phraseologies.
Right.
Is there any reason to doubt that it almost seems like a human thing to do?
It's a very human thing to do. And the kind of the underlining premise here of what I'm saying, Rabbi Jacobs, is that it's what the rabbis have told us, and that is that the Torah speaks in the language of men. At the end of the day, the Torah is not given from the Almighty to angels or from the Almighty to himself. It's given to humans at a certain age and a certain time. And so it uses the idioms of natural human beings. The purpose here is to communicate to humans in their own experience. And so for ancient Israelites who were slaves for hundreds of years, for whom the pharaohs are, the living end. I mean, I was just in Egypt. Those temples are, even today, by modern standards, they are really imposing, really imposing. You look at the reliefs of these pharaohs. Wow, it makes you really feel this small. And so to kind of take a deity who you can't see and you can't hear, and you want to give people a sense. Well, how great is this deity? And you say, okay, well, you take the greatest figure that you know and flip it over, and the deity is greater than that. That's what's going on. It's a communication to men.
Yeah. Okay. Fair answer. Will you take us through some of the slides that you prepared? Let's.
Sure.
Mr. Producer, please put up the first one, and let's get into some of the evidence as you've discovered it and written about it.
Okay, yeah. So the first thing I want to share is actually not my discovery. It was something that scholars discovered in the 1930s. So a little bit of background. Let's okay, can we get that map up? Okay, very good. All right. I want to talk about Ramses II. We think of ancient Egypt, oh, that's a big empire. And it was a big empire. But like all empires, it waxed and it waned. Its greatest period was what's called the Egyptian New Kingdom, 1500 to 1200 BCE. That was its greatest period. Within its greatest period, its greatest figure was Ramses II. And Ramses II's greatest accomplishment was something called the Battle of Kadesh, which is kind of where the white and the orange meet. He had this massive chariot battle. Scholars think it was the largest chariot battle of all time against his arch enemy from the north in modern-day Turkey, the Hittite Empire. Let's move on with the slides. Okay, let's move on. This is a papyrus version of something I'm going to talk about. Okay, good. When Ramses comes home, okay, let's see here. Oh, this seems a little bit strange. Okay, when Ramses comes home from Egypt, he plasters Egypt with accounts of this battle. Let's move through another slide, please. Okay, for some reason, these are sideways. I'm not sure why. It's kind of sideways. Let's see, or out of shape. So Ramses comes back and he plasters all of Egypt with accounts of this battle. Some are written and some are pictorial. Now, exactly what I want to show here is kind of out of focus. But in those pictures that we had before, what we have is that Ramses has a military camp, and in the middle there is for some reason it's flipped here. I'm not sure why. His tent. Let's move to the next slide, okay? Since the images aren't coming out so clear. But what you see is the following: that the images that we see in these reliefs have Ramses thrown his camp, his military encampment at the Battle of Kadesh, where in the center there is his throne tent, which has in it two chambers, a larger chamber and a smaller chamber. The larger chamber has dimensions of 2:1, and the inner chamber dimensions of 1:1. And the entrance to it is from the east, which in Egyptian maps is on the left side. All of this exactly mirrors what we see that the Torah says is the dimensions of the tabernacle in the desert, which the Torah tells us was at the center of a military camp. That is, the Israelites were in a military encampment, and they also have this fence around, and in the middle is this tent. The tabernacle is a tent, and it has two chambers, a larger one that has dimensions 2:1, and a smaller room that is 1:1, which is where the Holy of Holies is. And in Ramses' tent, it's where Ramses is. And in fact, in the pictures, which came out sideways on what we've shared, you can even see that above Ramses, you have, let's go to the next slide after this. Next. Okay, this one comes out right. Here we have one of those pictures of his throne tent, and you can see in the middle, there's two chambers, the left-hand one, where his servants are on their knees, kind of bowing to him. Excellent, thank you, Adam. And in the right side, now this is what you can't, there's a little, in the very middle there, you have the name Ramses. And to the left and to the right, you have winged figures. Can you see that, Adam? Can you point to those winged figures? There's one, there's the other. Winged figures with their hands spread out over Ramses, just like we have the cherubim in the tabernacle with their wings spread out effectively over the Ark of the Covenant. Okay, we're finished with this. We can go back to full screen of me and Rabbi Jacobs. Okay. Now, what scholars note is that there's these amazing parallels between the two, and they're unique. That is, we never find any other relief of a throne tent that looks at all like this anywhere in the ancient Near East. And we don't find any other temples or tabernacles in any other culture that looks like what we have in the Mishkan, what we have in the tabernacle. And so already in the 30s, what scholars proposed was that really, maybe there really were Israelites in Egypt. And maybe they really did have some type of victory over Ramses II. And the way in which the Torah concretized the idea that the Almighty is now the new king of kings, is by appropriating these pictures which the slaves had seen and saying, this is where the Almighty now resides. This is an idea of cultural appropriation, and these reliefs and the texts around them had no cachet any time after the time of Ramses II, nor are they known from anywhere outside of the land of Egypt. So it very much pins us to a specific place, a specific time, and a specific figure. And just to round out the argument, and then we can move on, my own contribution to this is that when you see the actual text of what Ramses said went on, you see remarkable similarities to the way in which the Torah tells about the exodus from Egypt. I'll just give one small example, that it says that Ramses' troops all ran away with fear when the Hittites surprised them with chariots, and then Ramses single-handedly smote 500 chariots. Funny how scholars still think that this text has some historical value when it says that Ramses smote, single-handedly 2,500 chariots, but that's for a different discussion. And then it says that Ramses' troops came back and they saw the corpses, the Hittite corpses, and they were amazed, and they saw his mighty hand, and then they broke out in praise to him. And this is exactly what we have in the Torah, that Bnei Yisrael, children of Israel, when they see the Egyptians charging at them in chapter 14 with chariots, they totally melt away. They abandon Moses, basically. And then God intervenes to save them. And then it says they came back and they saw the mighty hand. That's the term the Torah uses, Yad Agdolah, the mighty hand of God. And they saw the corpses along the banks of the sea, and they broke out in praise. And then there's all sorts of similarities in the terms. So it seems to me what the Torah is doing here is engaging in cultural appropriation on a mass scale. On a mass scale. This is all written up in that book that you mentioned, Anima Amin. It appeared in the Wall Street Journal. It was covered, and a bunch of scholarly publications. So for my money, this is very good evidence that Israelites were in Egypt. Something happened to them that they perceived as a miracle that they attributed to God, and the Torah concretizes this in the story of the Exodus.
Okay, that to me that's very thorough and very good evidence. And but I want to ask you another question along the lines of the one I was asking earlier. You essentially wear two hats. You have a scholar hat, and you've got your kippah. You've got your rabbi hat, and I guess I there's always, to me, there's some tension between the two, and I think you do a beautiful job of synthesizing both of those hats, and to that end, your work is unique and extremely valuable. My question is, does your good explanation, does your good evidence of the Jews' presence in Egypt and the Torah's familiarity with very specific designs and phrases from Egypt of that particular time, yes, we score a victory, so to speak, with showing that evidence. Do we also lose something in the process? Meaning, for instance, the Kabbalah talks in very grand terms about the tabernacle, its measurements, the items that are in it, and certainly portrays it as this, transcendent vehicle for achieving, unity with the Almighty. And do we cheapen it at all by saying, yeah, you know what? Yes, maybe, but really, it's based on this battle encampment of this pharaoh from a few thousand years ago, and they had the same thing.
Right. That's an excellent question. So I would say the following. Many religious people are raised and taught, about the holiness of the Torah, and they take it because this is the way in which they were brought up, and this is what was a truth for their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents going all the way back, and therefore the very question of, wait a minute, is there evidence for this? Can we prove it? Is already something that many people find grating. I understand. It would be kind of like if I were to go to my mother, okay, and I were to say, Mom, could I have just a little bit of hair of yours? Just one strand of hair. And I run off and I go to a DNA lab, okay, and I run tests and I discover, yes, I am my mother's son. And I run into her and I say, Mom, guess what? I'm your son. I mean, there'd be something problematic with that. But why? I'm only proving that I'm her son. So isn't that great? Wait a minute, you have to prove. So I think for some people from a religious background, this whole entire question, proof and archaeology, is beyond the point. This is our treasured inheritance. It's like going to find DNA for my mother's hair. Okay, so I understand that, and particularly with regard to the angle that you took it from, Rabbi Jacobs. The Kabbalah sees, all sorts of transcendent and otherworldly things going on with this tabernacle and this realm, this sphere, this realm, the 7 realms, and when the Kabbalah talks about the tabernacle, it's almost totally leaving the realm of something made out of real cloth and real skins. So this is true of everything having to do with Kabbalah. This is why a lot of rationalists, they might not dispel the Kabbalah or diss it, but it's a different headspace. And I find, Rabbi Jacobs, that Orthodox Jews, even though we all kind of look alike, we keep this basically the same laws of kosher food. We basically keep the same laws of Shabbat, etc., etc. But in terms of orientation and mind space, there really are two different groups. And it's not even, ultra-Orthodox and modern Orthodox, not even that. Even within ultra-Orthodox, there's two separate headspaces. One is a kind of a more rational one, and one is a metaphysical one, a Kabbalistic one, a mystical one. And it's very hard to translate the discourse of one into the other. And so typically you will find that Orthodox Jews, serious Orthodox Jews, are of one flavor or the other, and they can't really talk to each other about these issues. Just so, for example, maybe some of our viewers have had exposure to Chabad. I love Chabad. I think they do amazing work. But I personally have difficulty reading the Divrei Torah, the words of Torah, written by Chabad, not because, God forbid, I disagree or I think it doesn't have value. It's speaking a different language than I speak. I simply don't understand it. So I don't, and that doesn't mean that I diss it or that I say that it's not true. It's just, this, for a very long time, I would say Orthodox Judaism has functioned with two different headspaces, and people will be in one or they'll be the other. And they're both great, and I love lots of people on the other side. My headspace is in the rational one.
I'm reluctant to take the conversation too far down the road, although I'm like, as you're talking, I have 15 questions that come up. What does rationalism really mean? There's so much of the Torah that doesn't seem rational that even rationalists are compelled to accept, and I think that's a fascinating topic. And I wonder for myself, as you're talking, is I find myself drawn to both, frankly. And I wonder if there is some synthesis to be made, although that's, I guess, for me to ponder over time. But
I would just say it's like appreciating two different genres of music. You
right.
can't really combine, jazz and classical. Okay, each one has their own beauty, and you listen to them at different times, and you get from them different things. That's what I would say. That's my own.
Just funny you mentioned that, is I happen to have gotten a graduate degree in something called third stream music, which actually is a combination of jazz and classical music.
And maybe you can pull off this melange, Rabbi, in a way that I'm not able to.
I don't know, but anyway, I'm from what John and your major contribution to the rationalist side. So thank you. But okay. Is there another example that you'd like to share with us in terms of trying to prove that the Jews were in Egypt and left?
I think that this material that I've shared is the main thing. There's some other things that scholars point to. There is a very fascinating structure at Mount Ebal, Har Eval, in the Jordan Valley. Which is unlike any Canaanite altar that we have found, and it conforms in many ways to the laws of a Jewish altar. And they found there only the bones of kosher animals and remnants that would fit, including Egyptian remnants from the time of what tradition might hold as a possible date for the Exodus. Some want to say that this is the altar that is referred to in Joshua chapter 8 that was built upon entry into the land of Israel. So, I think there's that too as positive proof.
And I think I just read last night, if I recall, that there are settlements in Israel. I think you said there was hundreds of settlements that correspond to the time when the Jews would have left. Is that correct?
Well, sure, yeah, shortly thereafter, I'd say in the 12th century, and this is by all accounts, all archaeologists agree to this, that there is a whole string of new settlements that come up in what we call the hill country. That would be sort of modern day Samaria, maybe part of Judea as well. And these settlements typically have only kosher animals and have several other traits that seem to suggest that they might be related to things that are in the Torah. So that's also something that people point to as, a rise in, these new settlements might fit with parts of what says in the book of Joshua.
Are there scholars who disagree with you? Do you hold a minority opinion? And most feel like, it would be nice if there was such a story, but we don't have sufficient evidence
Sure.
to prove
Right.
it.
No, I'm glad you asked that, because I'm sure, Rabbi Jacobs, that many people at home are wondering, okay, this Berman guy, that's interesting. Those pictures are kind of interesting. But, I'm not, me being just a typical viewer, I'm not a specialist. How do I know that I can rely on this? So I would say as follows, that on the one hand, this stuff has been vetted, it was published, got into the Wall Street Journal, and it was published in books by Oxford University Press. But I think more importantly to your question, the truth is that in the world of biblical scholarship and archaeology, the question of the historical accuracy in any form of the Torah's Exodus account, it turns out that there are really two big schools. There are people that buy it, and there are people that don't. And one of the, I guess, kind of sad things that I've discovered is that there's something striking about the people who don't buy it and the people who do. The people who don't buy it overwhelmingly have voted for Democratic nominees for president in the last several elections. And those that do buy it vote for Republican candidates for president in the last few elections. That is to say, that those that are left-leaning and secular and afraid of religion and afraid of religion's encroachment on the public discourse, on the laws of our land, tend to have a dim view of whether there was an Exodus. And those that want to put up the Ten Commandments outside the state courthouse, and et cetera, and are just thrilled with God, whether he be the Jewish conception of God or the Christian conception of God, those scholars tend to think, yeah, there really was an Exodus, which is to say that scholars are human.
Right. Well, I think that's something that I've certainly learned over the last couple of decades, is that humanness of science comes through now and again, and the idea of a guy in a white lab coat, clinically coldly evaluating information is probably not accurate for the most part. And as you say, being human, they have their biases and want to push the meaning of the evidence one way or another. So that is interesting.
Right. I will say that no scholar has come out against the types of things that I was pointing to before, especially the many literary parallels between that Kadesh text and the Exodus account of the Exodus from Egypt. I haven't seen anybody who's taken me down on that.
Okay, good to know. There is, in your opening few chapters of Ani Maamin, you talk about the notion of history. And fascinatingly to me, you note that history as a modern concept doesn't start, I believe it was 1810 in Germany, was the first department of history. Can you explain to the audience what ancient peoples would have history meant and the difference to how we think of it now?
Wow. Okay. I hope we have enough time for this. This is kind of an involved thing because it's not intuitive. Let me just start, friends, with the following really cool observation. We all know that Eskimos have 7 words for snow, right? I don't know if there's still snow on the ground there, Rabbi Jacobs, in New York, as there was a couple weeks ago.
Tons.
Feet of it? Tons. Okay, right. Now, Eskimos have 7 words for snow. Why do they have 7 words for snow? Is it because there's 7 types of snow? We also have lots of different types of snow. But it's because the different types of snow are really meaningful for them because it really changes their lives. How fast they can sled and, what type of hunting they'll be able to do. So the snow, when you have an entity that's important in your life, you have a different word for it. And we, as city slickers, we see snow. It's not that we can't tell the difference between wet snow and dry snow. It just doesn't make much of a difference to us. Now, I raise this because there are, I'm going to throw out several words which are just so central to everything we talk about. And they're words that have no parallel in the Bible and no parallel in Rabbinic Hebrew and no parallel in any ancient Near Eastern language that we know. These words are fact, fiction, author, history. There are no words for those things. No words. Now, it's clear that, lots of people in the Bible, lots of people in the Talmud, rabbis in the Talmud, talk about the past. They talk about the past all the time. You don't really have a word history, and you never really find a distinction between fact and fiction. There's a difference between truth and falsehood, emet v'sheker, using Hebrew words, but there's no Hebrew words in the Bible or in rabbinic speak for fact versus fiction. This already, whenever we come across, this is one of the favorite things I like about being an academic. You come across these and you go, uh-oh, the world that I take for granted hasn't always been this way. So what's going on back then? So way back when people wrote about the past, they weren't writing what we call history. I would have to illustrate this. This could be a little bit involved, but basically, when we think of something that we call a history book, or when we read an article in a newspaper, we have assumptions that need to be laid on the table. They're so intuitive to us, they seem obvious, but I want to lay them on the table because when pre-modern writers, not just in the Bible, everywhere, when pre-modern writers were writing about the past, they had a different set of assumptions. So, for example, when we read either in a history book or in a credible newspaper, we assume that if this has been done the way it's supposed to be, that this newspaper article contains credible facts. If this something that isn't factual, that's bad. That's bad. We assume that we would never expect a newspaper article to end by saying, and therefore, dear reader, go out and protest. It never says that. Maybe it's kind of implicit, but you're not allowed in a newspaper article to say, and therefore go out and protest. You're not allowed to do that. We would never expect to say, to see in a newspaper any type of embellishment. So if someone were to write of, the events of January 6th at the Capitol, and as the rioters stormed the Capitol, a great darkness fell on Washington. You can't do that. I mean, everyone would. That's very nice. It's very literary. It gives a sense of the foreboding events, but you can't do that in a newspaper article. Just keep the facts. No embellishments, no calling out. We also assume that the person who's written a newspaper article is a journalist. What's a journalist? Well, it's someone who's had some training, how to get at the facts and, how to check facts in ways that maybe you and I don't have that training. So there's a very specialized profession called being a journalist, just like there's a very specialized profession being an historian. There's someone who knows how to get to archives and how to compare the different claims between them, which I don't know how to do. And then we assume also that, someone who's a journalist or an historian has been vetted. They have certain degrees. People who themselves are historians or who themselves are journalists have reviewed this person's work and have said, yes, they are responsible. They know how to do it well. And if it's in the New York Times, then it's probably, we hope, it should be pretty credible. Or if it's published, if it's a history book published by Oxford University Press, well, I would assume that's a good name. So maybe it has there's really something to it there. It's been vetted. And finally, whenever we read history or a newspaper article, we as readers are coming as consumers. We paid for that newspaper. We paid for that book. Or our library paid for that book. And we come as critics in this time. Wait a minute, it says here on CNN, blah, 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 blah. Let me go check. Let me go see what Google says about that. What are other people writing? So we're constantly in judgment. In ancient times, in pre-modern times, when people wrote about the past, none of that was true. And also in the Bible, what were they doing? They were taking what had been told about the past, and primarily what they were doing, I wouldn't call it history, I would call it using the tales of the past for exhortation. That is to say, to promote ideas, how to be a better Jew, how to be a better Christian, how to be a better Roman, okay? And whatever those things mean. They basically adhered to the stories they had received, but they absolutely engaged in calls, and therefore you should pray, and therefore you should fight with valor. And they absolutely would embellish to bring out the idea better, because they wanted to touch hearts. And the people that wrote these things were not trained historians or trained journalists, and they didn't have a word history. The people who wrote these things were people who had status in their own communities, generals and governors, who were the ones, or in Israel, prophets, or in the Christian world, the church fathers, the people who were entrusted to be the ones who knew what are the lessons that the masses need to learn. And when people came to these texts, they didn't pay for them, and they didn't go onto Google and check them. There was no way to check anything. People came to these texts, again, whether they were Jews coming to the Bible, or Christians coming to the New Testament, or Romans coming to read Tacitus or Herodotus or whoever it was, they came in submission. They came saying, oh, here is a text written by a great figure in our culture. And it is through these texts that I can learn how to be a better Jew, a better Christian, a better Roman. Let me open my heart and imbibe myself with the lessons that it's trying to teach. And so this is why we should not even expect that every single thing, every jot and tittle in the Torah or the Tanakh is exactly the way that it says that it is. That's a modern mindset, that only things that are facts are good. If it's not a fact, then it's false. Right? But what I say, if that's the bar that you bring to reading the Bible as a Jew, I say that when the Bible speaks and there's something that isn't exactly 100% factual, that's not fake news. You're being fake Jews. That's the problem. That's the problem. Rabbi Cook, Abraham Isaac Cook, who was the first chief rabbi of the land of Israel about 100 years ago, he wrote exactly this point. He said, every story that is in the Bible is written for the primary purpose of reaching into the souls of the readers and making a deep impression, to teach a lesson. Rabbi Cook says, when the Torah or when the Tanakh felt that just a mere presentation of the facts themselves would be sufficient to move a person in the way they needed to be, then the Torah would give just the basic facts. And if the Torah felt that in order to make the proper impression, a certain embellishment around a core that was historically true would help get the idea across, it had no compunction whatsoever about doing that. A lot of people don't know that, but it's very, very important, because otherwise a believer is really against a really, really challenging thing, because then all anybody needs to do is show any one little detail about anything anywhere in the Bible that doesn't match up 100% with what science says. You see? And here we have something where the Torah is lying, not giving a fact. Well, how can we trust any of this? That is being fake Jews. It's not fake news. That's my take.
So is it fair to say that the Torah is a literary spiritual development tool that is using the vehicle of history to teach and make its point?
The events are real. It's important for me to say this. This isn't just Aesop's fables, okay?
Right.
It's important because, as I said before, the Torah and the Tanakh, on its own terms, I mean, what this book says, if I had to sum up, this is a Tanakh, a Bible, okay? If I had to sum up this book, okay, in 2 sentences, it would be, here is a record of what you did right and what you did wrong, and what happened when you did right and what happened when you did wrong. And therefore, throughout the ages, do right. Try to stay away from doing wrong. None of that makes any sense if this is all Aesop's fables. So on its own terms, the Tanakh must be insisting that the basic core of these stories occurred.
So let me make one observation and then ask one more question, and maybe we'll move towards the wrap up. And this has been a fascinating conversation, as I knew it would be. The observation is simply that using this approach, you answer quite a lot of different questions that you might have about the text of the Torah, anything from the how long people lived in the book of Genesis to, was the flood really global, or was it just maybe localized and they just, so to speak, exaggerated it for effect? And therefore, for somebody who has trouble accepting, the veracity of the Torah in general, this might make it somewhat easier, as it gives you sort of permission to understand it in a, like you would say, in a more rational way. And I think that could be a very valuable thing for people to understand and to look into. But getting back to the Exodus, of course, for one more second, which is our main theme for today. Let's say it's true, it happened as you say, there were much fewer people than the Torah says who actually left Egypt, because that was an embellishment, that was to make a point, and I understand that, and it's all good and fine and good. I've asked this question in several forms, but does it take the miraculous out? And if so, what does it matter? Is there no room for the miraculous in the Torah? Is the transcendent aspect of it gone, and therefore does it matter as much if it is just a historical event that we've glommed onto to make some important points about freedom and whatnot? Where's the value of miracle in the Torah as you see it?
Right. So I'm kind of agnostic about this. Let me just say that, for example, about the plagues of Egypt, we even have some great rabbis of the past century who have taken issue, or I would say a position different than perhaps what most figures have just assumed throughout the centuries, that what it says, so it was written, so it was done, to quote Yul Brynner.
Right.
I'm dating myself on that one there.
I've seen it.
Rabbi Joseph Ber Soloveitchik, my dear mentor, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs of sainted and blessed memory now, both of them maintained there were miracles, but it wasn't the way in which the Torah says. These were all sort of naturally occurring events that just had great timing. That's what they say. I personally don't find that so compelling. That is, if God can control the exact timing of something, then he can do anything, basically. So I personally, just on a philosophical level, I don't see why the Almighty cannot intervene from time to time to do things once. That this can't be disproved. So I'm agnostic about it. I would say as following: if nothing miraculous happened, then I'll back up. I said I see good evidence that Israelites were slaves in Egypt. And I see good evidence that there's a text that we have called the Torah that in massive form engages in cultural appropriation against the greatest victory of Ramses II. So they must have felt that something had happened to them that was really cool, really big. And so, one would have to come up then with, well, what was it that happened that got these Jews out from under Ramses II? Whatever that was, that's what I want to call the miracles. But so maybe it was a real miracle. I don't know what it could have been or would have been if it wasn't. But for me, what's important is, what, Rabbi Jacobs, in the end of days, we all learn that there was no overt miracle, in the way that we were all kind of brought up. Then I would just chalk that up to as part of the embellishment that Rabbi Cook spoke about. But I don't insist on going there. So I'm kind of agnostic on this. It doesn't bother me that there were miracles. That would explain the story well. It reads nicely. And I kind of don't have an explanation for what led Israel to celebrate if there wasn't. And if in the end there wasn't miracles, I can live with that too.
Okay. Good place to stop. And this is the book, Ani Ma'amin, by Rabbi Joshua Berman.
Yeah, we should just say Ani Ma'amin. The subtitle is important. Ani Ma'amin, it means I believe. It's also the name of the kind of the creed that Maimonides wrote of what Jews are supposed to believe. The subtitle is Biblical Criticism, Historical Truth, and the 13 Principles of Faith.
Okay, go out and read it. And again, please subscribe to our YouTube channel below. Just hit that button. And if you want to get informed on what's happening in all of our programs coming up. And Rabbi Berman, I really wanted to thank you very sincerely. I've been looking forward to having this conversation for quite some time, and I appreciate you taking the time out to have it.
Okay, my great pleasure. And I understand that this is going to be aired closer to Passover, and everyone should have a happy and healthy and a kosher Passover.
Amen. Thank you. Have a good evening. Take care. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.